I intend to record a video about the full view of a society. I will make an introduction, then I will talk about the full view of a society, which is the document that I have just introduced. The logic of society, what happens in the modernity, in the modern world, and modern Western politics. So, about the introduction. Solving problems requires will and intelligence, and I have shared, and I will continue to share tools, intellectual tools, potentially with anyone. The structure of reality, or how I envision reality, and the references. I have Asperger, so I need to systematize, to classify, and to order my experience of the world. And the references are the books, the authors, the videos, the links, etc., etc. I share documents like this one that I have made today to simplify, to make very complex views accessible in a simple way. Simplified but not simple, maybe. Yeah, so my documents are incomplete, they are imperfect, they are lacking, etc., etc. I'm aware of this. They can be greatly improved. They are not even necessarily true for the aforementioned reason. They can be changed, modified, improved, etc. This is just my vision, my view at this moment in time. As I'm recording this, we're the 2nd of July 2023, and as an empirical individual, I am officially 31 years old. So this is the best in terms of intelligibility, complexity, order, structure, clarity that I have been able to provide at this moment in time, given the circumstances that I have encountered. I have shared videos on home economics. It has helped me a lot, personally, individually, to organize my life, to find balance, and to grow up. So I have shared the formal structure, the references, etc. It can be greatly improved, it can be modified, as I've said, but the content has to be filled with will, namely action. And as of now, as an empirical individual, I cannot act for others. I can share a map with others. This is what this document that I will comment in this video is. It's a map, in a way. I can offer guidance or give good pieces of advice, maybe. But the will, the praxeological aspect, it's for each individual to act if he wants to improve or to achieve, to attain the goals. Yeah. So, and I wrote, I fight morally and intellectually for the idea of the American Constitution, namely the idea of liberty. And there can be no liberty without discipline. I practice almost everything that I preach. I do not preach, but I practice almost everything that I encourage others to do. I try to be consistent. I do not have the time or as of now, the physical capability to do everything or to do everything perfectly, but when I give pieces of advice, usually, overwhelmingly, these are pieces of advice that I have been implementing consistently for, at the moment of the recording of this video, for many months, sometimes many years. So yeah. Also, I want for others, or I would like for others, what I want for myself, what I consider to be good for myself, and in this case, I am in need personally of clarity, order, and to have the means to find stability in a rapidly moving and sometimes very confusing world. So I want to offer, as of now, for others, the tools, the intellectual tools, which have enabled me to find more clarity, more order, and more stability, because I consider this to be good, given the current circumstances, one might say. Yeah. Also, I wrote, as of now, I have invested almost all my efforts in the intellectual aspect of my work, the rigor, but also the completeness. I've tried to gather knowledge on most topics to be able to understand at least the fundamentals and to be able to explain as much as I can the greatest amount of topics. And also the ethical aspect, namely to try to practice what I have considered to be good ideas, which enable to find order, stability, etc. In order to give more weight to my words. So that's the intellectual aspect and the ethical, one might say, aspect. So the consequence is that I haven't invested a lot in the formal aspect. Also I wrote, since I don't know who I talk to, I don't know, as of now, how to adapt my speech. I don't know who receives what is their level of education, intelligence, interest, knowledge, culture, etc. So I have made efforts, and I continue to do so, to be as clear and as accessible as possible without renouncing certain intellectual standards and requirements. So I try to make complex ideas accessible in a simplified way, or in a simplified way, but without giving up on intellectual demands, one might say. And I wrote, I try to find a compromise without compromising. That's the formula. I try to find a compromise between complexity, accessibility, clarity, order, etc., without compromising on principles. Okay, that was the introduction. Now, I will show the document again. Yeah. So, the full view of society. This document that I have modified very recently, today actually, in order to simplify, clarify my other documents. Yeah. It's, as I envision this, I've done this very briefly. It can be reorganized, rearranged, etc. But I've tried to find precisely the compromise between clarity, accessibility, order, simplicity and complexity at the same time. So, a society is a whole, a totality, and all the parts of the whole are interconnected. Here are the categories which structure, as I envision this, from bottom up. Everything is interconnected. I will comment more thoroughly. All the aspects are interrelated, interconnected. In a society, this is just a formal representation of what a human society is, with the fundamental, the most abstract categories, but all the aspects are interconnected, interrelated. So here are the simplified categories which constitute a society, and the categories can be envisioned as a way of dividing reality in order to make it intelligible and to make sense of it. To categorize means to classify, to separate, to order. Yeah. Also I wrote, a society exists within nature, and here nature is defined as the realm of physics, chemistry, geology, and biology, very simplified. So physics, chemistry, what is often referred to as the earth sciences, and biology. And biology, very simplified, it includes genetics, botanics, zoology, anatomy, which is the study of individual animals, and physiology, how the organism function. And here, for instance, sociobiology, which is the fundamental, in this view, the fundamental basis of a society, is in a way the transition between zoology and the social sciences. Namely, this is the biological, zoological aspect of humans. Namely, Aristotle said already, humans are social, political animals, zoion political animals. So human beings are rational animals. Therefore, what is true of zoology, the fundamental determination, it's also true for humans, but the more social aspect, in the case of humans, precisely, this is sociobiology. Yeah. Also, now I will comment briefly this document. So here in green, the categories which are surrounded or framed in green, from sociobiology to praxeology, sociobiology, anthropology, demographics, psychology, consciousness, physiognomy, praxeology, language, and intelligence. These are, very simplified, the categories of what can be called Subjektiver, Geist, subjective spirit, or in another form, the soul. These are the fundamental determinations. It can be envisioned as the fundamental determinations of the soul. The soul inhabits the body, it is connected with the body. So here we have the bodily, the psycho bodily determinations of man, namely the humans as in their natural biological bodily determinations, but with already a transition towards spirituality, what am I saying, in a sense of consciousness, intelligence, language. So yeah, that could be, if the soul in connection with the body had to be categorized, these would be the fundamental, the most simple, the most abstract categories which would enable to categorize the soul. Yeah. Then in red, so from family, culture, morality to government, with economics, technology and communication, finance, the state, rights, the budget, geopolitics, politics, ecology, globalism, and finally government, the categories framed in red, they correspond to what can be called as Objektiver, Geist, I will detail later, objective spirit, and that could be envisioned as the realm of the mind. So here we would have in green the soul, in red the mind, and in blue that would be absoluter Geist, absolute spirit, and this corresponds precisely to spirit as such. So that's the most spiritual aspect, art, philosophy, and religion, which express, in a way, are manifestations of the whole of society, in a way. The reflection, in a sense, of the manifestation, the self-conscious representation of the truth of society, you know. Yeah. So I wrote culture, that I have placed here, is partly connected with art, in a sense of sometimes culture refers to artistic productions. High culture is means often the aesthetic manifestations, literature, poetry, sculpture, painting, music, etc., etc. But here, culture, here it's understood in the sense of customs. The way people behave, it cannot be very easily quantified. That's why I wrote it's connected sometimes with art, And morality, that's the realm also of customs, ethics, rules of behavior, etc., codes of conduct. It's partly connected with religion. That's why the culture and the customs, in the sense of culture as connected with morality, family life, etc., can be said, the customs and the culture of the people can be said to be manifestations of its spirit. Here, spirit would have a different meaning than the most elevated forms, one might say, but it's partly connected nonetheless. Yeah. Here I think about an example. There is a book by Montesquieu, the 18th century Enlightenment thinker in France, which is titled The Spirit of the Laws. So the law would be here, for example, the spirit of the laws. We do not say the soul of the laws or the soul of economics. That's just an illustration of language, but we talk about the spirit of entrepreneurs, for instance, or the spirit of a political ideology, or the spirit of the laws precisely. But we do not talk about the soul. So implicitly already in language, we do not associate in ordinary language, at least in English and French and German, the word soul with these categories. In German, we talk about the Volkssoul, the Volksseele, the soul of the people, which is more connected precisely with anthropological, psychological determinations. Yeah. Yeah. That's just a brief remark. Yeah. Also, I wrote the line here. It's just structure, but the line family, culture, and morality. In a way, it's a transition between the Subjektiver Geist and Objektiver Geist. For instance, if we had to draw a parallel, like sociobiology is a transition between nature and society. It belongs to both. Human beings as sociobiological beings, they are determined by their natural determinations, precisely genetically, racially, ethnically, in terms of gender, in terms of instincts, evolutionary psychology, etc. So it's a transition between the natural and the social world, and here, family, culture, morality, it's a transition between the realm of the soul, one might say, and the realm of civil society, if we had to use if you have to qualify. I wrote it's the transition precisely between the tribe. The tribe would be a more instinctive unit, a more natural, spontaneous unit, whereas civil society, with the realm of law and order and rights and relationships of legislation, of written abstract legislation and politics as such, would be more objective in a way. So the family, culture, and morality is the transition, if we are to simplify, between precisely the tribe, the transition between the tribe, which would be here in anthropology, and civil society, which would be law and order and the state, and economics as well. And also the transition between the realm of tradition and customs. Here the traditions and customs would be a religious, cultural determination, and the realm of a conscious legislative order, which is another word for a rational legislative order, which is what the state is supposed to be in the good sense. So that's the transition. That's the window towards the exteriorization, which is supposed to to educate, to instruct, to train in a way, to shape the individual for in order to make him able to interact in the greater society. Yeah, that's the social role of the family, one might say. It can be envisioned as such. Yeah. Also, I wrote that each layer is a manifestation of the previous ones. Anthropology, demographics, and sociobiology are manifestations of biological tendencies of zoology and the evolutionary biology in a way. And each layer, as we move upward, one might say, contains within itself all the previous ones. So it's more and more spiritual in a way, because it encompasses each layer. I'm not saying that it's formally correct, but it makes sense more or less. It can be modified, it can be changed, etc. But each layer, in a way, contains within itself, in a way, it manifests, it is the manifestation of all the previous layers. For instance, law and order, they are a reflection, a manifestation of morality, or lack thereof. Yeah. Economics, in a way, macroeconomics is, in a way, it's a manifestation of home economics or household economics or household management. And there have been metaphors which used to think, especially in the 19th century, which used to think of entrepreneurs and businessmen as regards to their employees. They were sort of behaving like fathers as regard to their children. In the 19th century, early 20th century industry and businesses, the big CEOs or the businessmen who run companies, they treated sometimes their employees, their workers, in a paternalistic way, for the good, sometimes the negative aspect, but that was this is what sometimes is criticized in 19th century capitalism, namely that the entrepreneurs had a paternalistic view of their workers, which had good aspects and negative aspects as well, but good aspects nonetheless. So that's just an illustration. And the state is supposed to be an association of families. Actually, no, a tribe is an association of family, and eventually when a group of people becomes sufficiently numerous, it constitutes usually a state in order to regulate the interactions between a great quantity of individuals. So yeah, and philosophy is the conceptual, the rational grasping of all the aforementioned reasons plus the determinations of nature. And philosophy expresses in thoughts what religion and art express in images, metaphors, symbols, etc., etc. Also, I wrote praxeology here. Humans, they exteriorize when they act, they exteriorize, they make manifest, in a way they realize the content of their soul. That would be the inner determination here, that would be psychology, the feelings, the imagination, the desires, the tendencies, the memories, the emotions, etc., the instincts. Through action, that's the realm of praxeology, humans exteriorize their inner determinations, and they can exteriorize through language, which in a way it's a form of action. When it's consciously done, to speak is a means of acting, but they can also act physically as such. But although strictly speaking language is a physical action because it requires effort of moving the tongue and the mouth, etc., or even if it's written language, it requires to typewrite on a computer board or on a table board with a pen. So yeah, speaking and or acting in a more manual way, one might say, is a means of acting. It's an exteriorization of inner determination through conscious action, if it's consciously done. Yeah. And the economy, here that's I wrote economics, actually that's more the economy, and sociology as well. The economy is the sum, in a way, of all humans interacting. Market forces are manifestations of the actions of all humans. And society, as a realm of institutions, so it includes the state, politics, finance, the economy, law and order, etc. Society is the realm of what can be defined as consciously regulated human interactions. The institutions, here at this level, they would be implicit, or they are often implicit. The relationship are regulated by non-written rules and usually mutual trust. That's the appeal that primitive societies, either in the past or even in the modern world, societies which have not entered the division of labor, one might say, the modern globalized division of labor, they arouse a lot of attraction, and they exert a lot of appeal, because in primitive, which are often limited quantitatively in terms of number, in primitive societies, the people, they have institutions like marriage, rites of passage, hierarchies, etc., but they are often personal, because the tribes or the groups are not numerous enough to have developed a very complex division of labor with institutions which are supposed to guarantee abstract expressions of human interactions, that which we call law, with courts, institutions like banking, schools, hospitals. Hospitals are not an institution as such, but the school, academia, banks, courts, etc., etc. These are, or parliaments, these are institutions. So when society grow, either in number or in size or in historical development, they tend to exteriorize their interactions by writing them through law. That's why I wrote society can be envisioned as the realm of consciously regulated human interactions. So, in a way, these documents illustrate a progress. It's not necessarily for the better, although most of the time it is, but a progress from the more instinctive, the more natural, the more spontaneous, one might say, to the more rational, the more spiritual. That's a rationalization of natural tendencies, instincts, etc. This is what a society, as I defined this just earlier, the realm of consciously regulated human interactions, and objectivized, not only consciously regulated, but objectivized through institutions, independent institutions, one might say, independent from interpersonal relationships. That's a progress to a more rational, a more spiritual view. That's why the boring German metaphysician says that the state is the embodiment of reason on earth. Well, I understand what he means, but sometimes the state becomes a little bit irrational. and art, religion, and philosophy. And here, philosophy in the broadest sense, it includes the sciences, the study of physics, chemistry, biology, and all the other topics, sociobiology, psychology, economics, etc., political theory. So, art, religion, philosophy, which includes the sciences, are the most spiritual expressions of human activity. They are the most detached from the senses, from the natural, material substratum in a way. And philosophy is pure thought, thinking itself in a way. And I wrote, a society is unintelligible if all the aspects are not taken into account. Maybe in order to make sense of a society and the world at large, all the aspects, at least in their fundamental determinations, have to be taken into account. Here I just take an example. If, when talking to a country, one only talks about the economic or political aspects without mentioning all the other aspects, it can give information, but otherwise, if it's disconnected from the rest of the categories, it's unintelligible. And precisely because everything is interrelated, interconnected. And I wrote, I am spiritually connected to people who are intellectually perfect, which means here perfect means complete. People who have explored and who explore and understand most of the topics, and to be really spiritual in an intellectual way, to have an intellectual view of spirituality means to be able to understand, to grasp most of the determinations, and to be able to make sense and to shed light and to say intelligent things on most of the topics. And people who understand most of the aspects, or all the aspects, at least in their fundamental determinations concerning a society and an era, they tend to be spiritual in the intellectual sense, but also when they connect the anthropological, sociobiological, psychological aspect with spirituality, they tend to be spiritual in a religious sense, and this is what has happened to me. What I call the European gods. Here, these are the old ones. These are individuals who understand most of the aspects, or all the aspects in their fundamental determinations, and that's why they are the most perfect. Here perfection, of course, it's good, but it means to incorporate all the aspects. A perfect intellectual is an intellectual who is capable of saying intelligent things and making intelligent judgments on most topics most of the time. This is what distinguishes a specialist, which would be focused only on one topic, from a generalist who is able to understand the interconnectedness. This is a meaning of spirituality, not in a sense of, here it's not in a religious sense, but spirituality in the intellectual meaning. A spiritual man, a spiritual thinker, is someone who is capable of connecting most of the aspects. This is what differentiates great intellectuals from specialists, which are only experts in their own field, and no matter how efficient they might be, and they can be intelligent and efficient and competent as well, of course, but the limits, the distinction between a specialist and a full, more perfect intellectual is the ability to connect the various layers and to see the full picture. Yeah. Okay. Now about the logic, what I call the logic of society. The reason, on an individual level, the reason why I have dedicated a lot of time trying to organize, order, structure home economics, here that's household management. The reason why it's important, in a way, I understood this because of I studied logic. A society is made up of individual households, and if a lot of people within a society, a lot of households, which itself, they are composed of individuals. In a household, there can be one individual if he or she lives alone, or two or three or four, five, more, up to, depending, it can go to more than 10, but a household here means individuals living under the same roof and sharing a daily life, in a way. It can briefly, that's one of the sociological definitions. Yeah, so if individuals in a society or individual households, if a lot of them are sick, the whole of society cannot be healthy. So there is a reciprocal determination between the health of a society, which can be reflected in the political situation, when I say, and the individual units which comprise the elements, in a way, which constitute the whole. So what I've understood is that there is often the delusion in modernity that politics can solve or has the legitimacy or the role of solving problems by enacting laws and legislation, or by increasing the budget, more spending. So here, budget, for instance, it includes the educational system, the healthcare system, the welfare state, etc., the retirement system, etc., etc. So there is this belief that politics and politicians have the power or the legitimacy to solve problems, but actually the views of the libertarians like Ron Paul is that actually there's responsibility on the part of individuals to fix their own problems to the greatest extent possible, and in a libertarian perspective, the state is seen not as an enabler or a helper of individuals and families, but rather as a hindrance, which prevents very often individuals from solving their own problems by enacting bureaucratic regulations which prevent the finding of solutions, or sometimes encourage, unconsciously or indirectly, individuals to become dependent. A society is, that's a tautology when I say that the whole is composed of all of its parts. So there is a reciprocal logical interaction, namely the healthy individuals have to contribute to the health of the society, and a healthy society has to contribute back to spreading, encouraging the health of as many individuals as possible. And when one is sick, the other tends to become sick as well. Bad politicians or rulers or bad laws, they tend to produce bad behaviors in terms of morality, culture, and household and family life. But here it's very difficult to be able to identify the causal relationship. But for instance, a decline in morality leads to a decline in religion, but the reverse is true as well. So here it's very difficult to clearly see the causal process, but they are in a mutual, reciprocal reciprocal interaction. A sick society tends to produce sick individual psychologically, in terms of customs, etc., etc. So, how to solve problems? It requires an effort on the part of all or most individuals and individual households, and virtuous behaviors bring about virtuous laws and virtuous policies, which reinforces the process, but vicious, if one might talk about virtue and vice, as well. So that's a Wechselwirkung, namely reciprocal determination. And the reason why I have spent a lot of time individually working on household management and trying to share references, links, structure, etc., is to enable, to help those who are in need to find order and stability to the greatest extent possible in their individual life. And if more and more people do so, society can heal as a whole. Yeah. And also another logical determination, the inner and the outer, like the soul exteriorizes itself through action, that's praxeology, through language and purposeful behavior. Economics is human action, in a way. Like law is, like I said earlier, the consciously regulated behavior of interacting individuals. So the inner tends to exteriorize itself. People who suffer inwardly for psychological or physical reason, they tend to exteriorize their suffering. It's true often on the level of individuals, but on the level of societies as well. And geopolitics can often, historically or to the present day, be understood, partly, it can help to understand that when societies have political, economic and or social problems, they tend to exteriorize their problems. And here, historical example, the migrations of the 19th century, or even before, from the starting the 16th, 17th, up until the 19th century, the emigration of a lot of Europeans to the New World, Northern America, Southern America, South Africa, New Zealand, Australia, etc., was an attempt, or colonialism sometimes was an attempt to solve internal problem in European societies, poverty, lack of resources, like the Irish emigrating to the US because of the famine in Ireland, etc., or overpopulation, poverty, etc. This still is a reason for a lot of migration. Imperialism is an attempt to find resources, either in terms of land, soil, it can be oil, rare precious metals, or people, to tax, to be able to tax more people. Or in the Middle Ages, the Crusades, it was partly an attempt to direct the inner conflicts of European societies outwardly. It's too simplistic to reduce geopolitics to the attempt to solve inner political problems within societies, but it can explain a lot. Societies which are unstable, they tend to exteriorize either through migration, colonialism, imperialism, etc., etc. There are problems, yeah. And that's why talking about geopolitics in the modern world, China, Russia, etc., whose interests are supposed to collide sometimes with the interests of Western societies, from the perspective of the West, a lot of Western societies have so many internal problems at all levels that to to blame others for supposedly. I'm not saying that it does not exist, because each actor in the geopolitical game tries to defend his interest, and that's how it works. But Western societies have an enormous amount of inner problem at all levels. So to put the blame, and that's the truth. It's true from the Western perspective, but it's true from other perspective as well. To blame the West, a lot of the time Western societies are blamed by non-Western societies for their own internal problems, and we have the same in the West. So that's how it works. Sometimes it's genuine, but sometimes it's not, in a sense that when the problems are really internal and structural, blaming an other outside, it's often a cheap way, and a way to manipulate. So yeah, that's why I wrote, I don't believe in politics, because Western societies have become really sick, probably overwhelmingly because of an excess of wealth, prosperity and welfare. So these are rich people's problems. I mean, they have the problems that modern Western societies encounter are the result of an excess of wealth in the 1950s and 60s, which was the most affluent era in the history of the world, to the greatest extent possible. Yeah, it has brought about ideologies which in a way are the result of a very prosperous situation, but when the prosperity declines, the problems accumulate. There's a change of perspective, and here I've written a non-moralistic view. So here it means non-judgmental, but a lot of socially degenerate behaviors in the modern West are tolerated because of the welfare state, because the welfare state acts as a security net. So there are a lot of behaviors which would not be tolerated or would not even be made possible if the state did not redistribute an enormous amount of money, either that it takes in taxes or borrows on future generation. For instance, sexual loosening, individual vices of all sorts, in terms of morality, etc., unemployment, lack of respect, selfishness, egotism, etc., etc. These kind of unemployment, in the sense of a society which finances people, which subsidizes people for being unemployed. That's not most of the time, or here it's difficult to quantify, but a lot of time it's not their personal responsibility. Sometimes it is, sometimes it's not. But a society which becomes a gigantic welfare state, it comes from a good intention and from prosperous conditions, but it's by subsidizing behaviors which in more economically what is the term? Less economically prosperous conditions would not be subsidized. Unemployment would not be subsidized. Vices and sexual loosening would not be encouraged. Selfishness could not be tolerated, etc. So a lot of these behaviors are made possible, and they are reinforced unconsciously or sometimes consciously by the redistribution of wealth through the welfare state, etc. So yeah, so that's a non-moralistic view, namely people who behave in a socially dubious way. It's not their individual fault, in the sense that if people are subsidized or encouraged, either directly financially or by the media, by the overall culture, the overall morality, if there are no hindrances to behavior, if there are no longer restrictions, or if restrictions are considered to be bad, etc., it's a logical consequence that people will behave loosely as long as the economic conditions which have brought about this situation will continue. Yeah, so formulated differently, the selfishness or the individualism, but actually it's not individualism, it's egotism and selfishness which exists significantly in a lot of modern Western societies is made possible only because people are overly socialized through redistribution, law, regulations, etc., etc. So in a way, it's only in a collectivist society in terms of redistribution and regulation and bureaucracy that people can have the luxury of not behaving decently from a social standpoint. It's not because they are bad, it's because the economic conditions enable them and sometimes subsidize or encourage them not to be virtuous. And here virtuous means to act ethically in terms of morality, ethics, customs, etc. The dissolution of customs, morality, religion, which has occurred in a lot of Western society, has been made possible only because of very prosperous conditions of life. When the conditions become less prosperous, people are forced, not because suddenly they become better, sometimes they do, but they are forced to behave more socially in a good sense, more responsibly, etc. That's how it works. Also, I wrote, blaming the rich or the politicians or etc., or the migrants or categories of population for problems, it's often an easy solution, but here in the case of the rich, who buys the goods and services which made the rich wealthy in the first place? These are the consumers. So the rich, if the conditions of the market are free and honest, if there is no cronyism, corruption between financial, economic interest and state political interest, if the rich become wealthy in a free market without the subsidies, the corruption, the lobbying of the state, without subsidies from the state or corruption or lobbying on their part to corrupt the government, one might say, then in a way they deserve, and here they deserve their wealth simply because they get wealthy by providing goods and services that people on their own free will are willing to buy. The superstars in sport, entertainment, etc., they make their money because they provide services that people buy. They are not forced. People are not forced to watch ball games, listen to music, watch movies, etc., etc. But they are forced to obey state-implemented legislation when they favor big financial or economic interest. So here, the view of Schumpeter and Mises is simply that, in a way it's self-evident, but it's not often understood or realized, that the rich people in a free society become rich precisely by providing goods and services at the lowest possible price to the greatest amount of consumers. So the wealth of the rich in a free society is the result of their ability to please their fellow men as consumers. Yeah. And here a remark from Friedrich Hayek. The average bureaucrat often has a lot more power over you than the wealthy billionaire. An average bureaucrat has a power to coerce and to as a power of coercion that very few billionaires have. But sometimes, of course, the billionaires, they use their influence, their power, their money, etc., to go in bed with government and to indirectly implement regulations which are enacted by bureaucrats and which advantage the powerful financial interest, of course, but self-made billionaire, yeah, it's a way of talking, but billionaires who are very rich people, very powerful people who become rich by their own merit as individuals, in a way, they do not have a lot of power over the people. They have here, that's the common sense remark from Hayek. Yeah. And also I wrote, so it's easy to blame the rich or the politicians or other groups, but when the question is asked, how many people are on the paycheck of the state? How many people in modern societies, especially in the West, benefit directly or indirectly from the state? Directly would be the civil servants, people who are direct employees of the state, or indirectly would be those who benefit from redistribution. If we list all the social workers, the teachers, the unionists, the politicians, and here in the private sector, the small business owners who need cheap labor and who are in favor of unregulated immigration because it benefits them from an economic standpoint, to blame one group of people, whether these are the rich, the politicians, the migrants, or any other group, if the counterpart is not taken into account, it's not fair in a way. Yeah. Because precisely, let us take the example of blaming the rich. It's a cheap way for the politicians to gain power, but those who grant power to the politicians who say blame the rich, most of the time these are people who are in a situation where they have a direct interest in the perpetuation, the continuation of the current state of affairs. And here that's a play on word, the current state, maybe the current state apparatus. Here to illustrate, a lot of social workers or civil servants, usually they vote for leftist political parties because this is the state who gives them their bread by paying their wages and their salaries. So that's how it works. When a society becomes overly socialized, people are overly dependent on the state, which means the taxpayer. So that's the view of Bastia, the French libertarian economist of the 19th century. The state is the great illusion, the great deception, the apparatus through which everyone tries to live at the expense of everyone else. Yeah. Yeah. So here that's a way of criticism. That's not a criticism, but that's how it works. Of the left and the right, namely, usually people who blame migrants, not always, but those who blame migrants, they just would like to have the benefits of the state for themselves. And they project their frustration onto migrants. On the left, they blame the rich. Yeah, but both are part of the apparatus of oppression in a way that they are victims of. They benefit, but in a way they are also victims of this. Yeah. That's why the libertarians, they are coherent. Reduce the government, the state, the budget, the taxes to the minimum, and grant the greatest amount of liberty to the greatest amount of people, and they will be forced to adapt and to adjust. And yeah, that's a coherent view, a consistent and coherent view. Also, I wrote, blaming a group of people based on natural determinations, biological determinations, is morally wrong. I will explain later why it's morally wrong. For instance, misogyny, blaming women, racism, blaming a group based on its ethnicity. It works for white people as well. Blaming whites because they are white, that's a form of racism, or anti-Semitism, etc. So blaming a group of people collectively based on natural determinations is morally wrong. Blaming a group of people based on social determinations is wrong as well, but it's less wrong than natural determination because there is more potential to change the social determination. Here, the insult to blame the politicians. I have done this and I continue to do so when I say, but it's an easy way. Sometimes it's legitimate, but it's easy. Here, the left, they tend to blame the rich, the right, the populist right, they tend to blame either the politicians or the immigrants or both. But sometimes it's very cheap way to put responsibility on another group in a way. So blaming a group of people based on social determinations is wrong as well, but less wrong than blaming people on natural determinations, precisely because you can change to a certain extent your social determinism, but not your natural ones. So to blame the politicians, the civil servants, the rich, the unemployed, the uneducated, the city dwellers, the rednecks or the hillbillies as they call this, or etc. It's morally wrong as well. So usually the right, the libertarian right, the free market right, they tend to blame the unemployed and the civil servants. The populist left, they tend to blame the rich. The liberal, successful leftists, they tend to blame the uneducated and the rednecks, the hillbillies, the rural population. The populist right, they tend to blame the city dwellers, etc. And I wrote, leftists, very often, not always, but sometimes, they are socially hateful. So leftists, they are very moralistic when it comes to censoring expression of frustration in the realm of anthropology, gender, etc., ethnicity, gender, race, etc. So in a way, that's why the left has the moral high ground, because it's genuinely true and good not to blame people based on their ethnicity, gender, racism, misogyny, if it means to hate an entire group of people just because of their natural determination. Of course it's morally wrong, and that's why the left very often has the moral high ground, because they denounce this. But the hypocrisy of the left often, not always, but often, is that they compensate their moral purity by ferocious class hatred. And a lot of leftists, not all of them, but a lot of leftists, they are really socially hateful in a way that a lot of right-wingers are not. There are also socially hateful right-wingers. The bourgeois or the aristocratic right, sometimes they are hateful towards the working class, it's true. But social hatred, usually, it's much more prevalent on the left. And that's why the real, the higher level in terms of morality, well, the morality of conflict, I love it. To confront an ideology is morally better than either confronting a group of people based on natural determinations or social determinations. To confront an ideology, because the reason here is simply that it's much more easy to change an ideology than to change your social determinations or your natural determinations. That's why it leaves a greater room for improvement on the part of the people that you confront, in a way. That's why it's morally good in the realm of struggle and conflict to confront ideologies and not people either based on biological or social determinations. So here, for instance, when I wrote, this is what psychological and moral growth means. To direct the frustration that a lot of people experience, not on a specific group of people, either in terms of biology or class in the broader sense, but on an ideology. And here, my problem, one might say, is with socialism, and socialism can affect people of all ethnic groups and genders, but also of all social classes. There are political socialists, there are socialist civil servants, there are rich and wealthy socialists, a lot more than is often envisioned. That's when you develop intellectually, you realize that actually a lot of very rich people, they are socialists. And a lot of so-called poor people, the working people, a lot of them, actually they have capitalist instincts, which simply means private property and not too much interventionism, and just the will to be able to organize their own life. Especially the Americans, the American people, that's why they are so great. Here, the average American, traditional American people, in terms of ideology, precisely, it can apply to people of all origins. Overwhelmingly, it appeals to white people, but it can apply to the average Afro-American worker or Hispanic, etc. The uneducated, there are uneducated socialists, but there are also very well educated, because to blame the uneducated, that's usually the liberal left who does this, but actually the populist right does the opposite. They blame the intellectual elite. So there are socialists among the uneducated and among the very educated as well. It's true for capitalism as well, or nationalism, or whatever ideology. There are socialists among the city dwellers and among the rural population, etc. So an ideology can be changed much more easily because you can more easily convince your opponent. That's why it's morally good within the realm of conflicts. If there are, or when there are conflicts, it's morally good to confront an opponent based on his ideology, because you can potentially you can convert him or convince him, or maybe you can be convinced that his views that you thought was wrong, maybe it's not as bad as you thought it would be. If you are genuinely honest, you can acknowledge that maybe the other is correct and you are wrong. Accepting this possibility, envisioning this, is part of intellectual maturity. It's very demanding, because people most of the time, they have precisely biological instincts, the will to assert themselves, to dominate, to gain status, etc. It's socio-biologically determined, of course. It applies on all levels. There are a will to power. Here it's not necessarily in the negative sense, because it can be a will to compete, a will to achieve, to show off, but not in a frivolous way, but in a competitive way. That's what drives competition in all its forms, in a way. And it can be healthy if it's regulated in a way. If it's genuine competition for the improvement and the betterment of the competitors, one might say. So ideological confrontation is much more moral than social or ethnic confrontation, because you leave the room, it leaves the room for the other, and for the self eventually maybe, to change for the better. But just to understand this, it requires a lot of intellectual and moral and psychological growth and development. That's why here I will talk maybe like a wise American politicians. I'm not sure that there are many, but those who are wise, they really are wise politically. Blaming what I call socialism, which is actually collectivist, statist, bureaucratic intervention. Here it's just a word to express dependence on the state. Yeah. But who is socialism? What is socialism? Who are the socialists? Precisely, if you think in an intelligent and wise fashion, the socialist, it can work for the capitalist. If you envision yourself as a leftist, who are the capitalists? These are not a group of people with social determinations like the socialists. These are not a social class. The capitalist, no, it's everyone. Like the socialist, it's everyone. Namely, as a consumer, you as a consumer of goods and services, you act to reinforce capitalism if you buy products on the free market. When you go to the restaurant, when you do buy your daily groceries, when you spend leisure, when you buy an insurance for your car, when you buy goods and services, etc., you consume and you participate in the capitalist economy. And the same, the reciprocity is true in terms of socialism. The socialists are all those who want state regulation or state redistribution for their own benefit. That's why, in a way, there are capitalists and socialists within each person. That's why it's an internal struggle, in a way. And that's why you can improve. And here, I'm not saying that I'm good, but I am saying that I have improved on this aspect. Namely, I have tried to get rid as much as possible. It's a constant effort, it's a process, but to get rid of the socialist in me. I come from a difficult starting position, so I have a lot of work to do, but to try to become more and more independent. It's a constant work on oneself. It's a daily requirement. It requires discipline, effort, etc. So that's a struggle against the self, in a way, which is, in the sense, it's kind of good, because yeah, and here I try to envision a leftist perspective. Those who blame capitalism, one way of struggling against what the leftists call capitalism can be simply to improve yourself individually in terms of competence by studying and being more disciplined, but also as a consumer, it means to renounce the commodities that capitalism offers, and no one forces the consumers to buy a lot of commodities made available in a capitalist free market economy, whereas that's the difference between capitalism and socialism, whereas the socialist goods and services, namely state intervention, they are forcefully imposed onto everyone. That's the fundamental difference. In a way, it's more easy to renounce capitalism in its good and bad aspect in a free society than it is to renounce socialism in its good and bad aspect in a socialist society. Yeah. So that's what I could say. Here, in a way, what I say is kind of intelligent. It can be improved, but it has taken me really a long time of intellectual, psychological development, growth, and maturity. Here we are in July 2023. I still have a long way to go, I guess, but it has taken me a lot of time to understand this. But then, I will talk about science a little bit later. I will talk about this now. I will. Yeah. So, what I intend to talk about, I call this "What Happens in Modernity?" Question mark. My interpretation. Here, that's the utility of this document. That's my personal interpretation expressed ordinarily. The Germans of the 20th century consciously founded politics on sociobiology, anthropology, and demographics. And to a lesser extent, so did the Italians and the Japanese. But it was much more prevalent among the Germans. Yeah. For the German nationalists of the 20th century, a society was the manifestation of a people. here on this document, what is in red on the document, in their view, was the manifestation of what is in green. And I wrote, I partly agree epistemologically, I partly agree, namely, that's what I will talk about, it's simply logical that the institutions of a society, they partly reflect the people, here that would be the demographics, but here that would be from a strictly biological standpoint, but there is also the psychological and moral aspect. It partly reflects the socio-biological foundation of a society. Here I agree epistemologically because it's true, but it's not correct to reduce. It's not correct morally and or epistemologically to practice what can be called epistemological reductionism or socio-biological reductionism, namely to explain that all the upper echelons or the upper layers are just the reflection, here it means the manifestation of the lower aspect. It's not correct to practice reductionism in a sense. And here I just illustrate. Western whites, white people of Western countries, here the West means west of Poland, so northwestern Europe plus the former Anglo-Saxon colonies, the former English colonies and predominantly populated by Anglo-Saxon, Canada, the US, Australia, New Zealand, to simplify. That's what I mean by Western whites when I talk about this as of now, is Western whites have degenerated socially and partly morally, not all of them, but Western predominantly white societies have degenerated socially and morally since the 1960s, one might say, without socio-biological decline, although it has partly occurred for inherent reason, the Industrial Revolution, the dysgenic processes which have affected all industrial societies for the past 2 centuries, basically since there has been industrialization, so it's partly true, but it's not enough and it's not correct simply because culture, ethics, family values and religion in a broader sense, they are very important as well. So basically, the people, here I'm talking about Western whites, the people of the 1950s and early 1960s has not dramatically changed over the subsequent decades. I'm talking about white people. But the ideology has changed because of the Cultural Revolution in the 1960s. So that's what I said earlier in the video. The people, in a way, they have not become worse morally, or if they have, it's not, in a way, on their own fault. It's simply because the conditions, the material conditions with the tremendous prosperity of the post-war economies of a lot of Western countries, Germany, France, the US, of course, etc., has brought about different, and also the development of technology, of contraceptive methods, etc., communication. It has brought about changes in the economy, here that's partly vaguely a Marxist analysis, changes in the economic structure of society has brought about changes in morality, culture, and religion. Basically, formulated more simply, people have become wealthy, and as it often happens, has happened historically, when a society has become really wealthy, they become morally decadent. It happened in ancient Greece, ancient Rome, so that's why to reduce social problems to a socio-biological interpretation is not enough, but to completely disregard the socio-biological explanation is not correct either. And here, that's why the modern, here, that's why I intend to talk about precisely. The Germans of the past century and the Japanese, the Italians, and they were defeated militarily. So their ideas have been discredited, and here that's the story of the eugenic movement. Even ideas which were considered to be respectable, at least among highly educated circles in liberal democratic societies like Sweden, England, the US, have been, de facto, they have been discredited as well because of the excesses of the Germans and the Japanese and the misuse of science in the search of ideological and political domination. Yeah. So that's what is called, in a way, shooting the messenger, because ideas, scientific views, not all of them, but some views about science, namely the idea that science, the science of biology, applies to human. That's one way of formulating sociobiology. These scientific views have been completely discredited for political and moral reasons because of the excesses of the past century. But it's not because they have been morally discredited that they have been epistemologically refuted, and a lot of time they haven't. Moral condemnation is not sufficient. It's not an argument in the sense that to morally condemn an ideology or the misuse of science, or the misuse of a scientific discovery or innovation. It doesn't mean to refute epistemologically. Here, in a more politically correct way, to condemn the use of the atomic bomb on Japan, or to blame the pollution by industry, the chemical pollution, it's not an argument against the epistemological validity of physics or chemistry. To blame the effects that the application, some of the application of physics or some of the applications of chemistry can bring, and sometimes bring to society, it's not an argument to refute the epistemological validity either of physics or chemistry. And what is true of physics or chemistry, it happens to be true of biology as well, namely to refute the excesses of eugenics or scientific racism, and to condemn morally. It's not enough to refute epistemologically some sociobiological truths about humans. So here there is really, this is precisely what I intend to talk about, there is really a this is what happens in modernity precisely. There has been over the past many decades a interpretation, or there has been a rejection on moral ground. Yeah, there has been a confusion in a way, partly consciously encouraged and partly unconsciously, namely there has been a confusion between epistemology, namely the theory of knowledge, the validity of the sciences, and morality. And the consequences of the excesses of the application of science have brought the very scientific enterprise into disrepute. But moral condemnation is not sufficient to invalidate or to refute a scientific truth if it is true. Here, I just take an example. Richard Dawkins says that eugenics could very well function for humans. Whether eugenics is good or bad, morally desirable or not socially, it's not an epistemological question. That's not a judgment of value, it's not a moralistic judgment. Here, a libertarian view, that's what Stefan Molyneux says, and actually, when you grow intellectually, you kind of agree. If the state try to implement eugenic measures to compensate maybe dysgenic measures, but if the state tried to do this, it would leave room for an increase in state intervention, power, and regulation, which is not desirable. Yeah. But yeah, what Dawkins said about eugenics is that to reject to reject the possibility based on moral arguments is not an argument against its feasible aspect. To answer the question, is it right or wrong, should it be implemented or not, does not answer the question, would it be efficient? What Richard Dawkins said is that it would work because it works on animals, and humans are a particular variety of animals, so it would work on humans as well, not necessarily to breed an Aryan master race, but if some society decided to selectively breed humans to select for height or weight or ability to run fast or intelligence or agreeableness or altruism or whatever, like breeds of dogs, the purposefully chosen goal could be selected. Yeah, but what Dawkins said here, it's very intelligent. It's philosophically significant. Is that from a scientific standpoint, epistemology and morality should not be confused in the sense that morally refuting a theory or a view is not sufficient to epistemologically refute it. If it's true, it cannot be epistemologically refuted. Yeah. So, I wrote, it is no longer acceptable morally, politically, in Western societies, a lot of them, since the 1950s and 60s, to express certain views on the topics in green. There are views, language usually, it's okay, but actually no, precisely because newspeak and political correctness is a manipulation of language, so actually no. There are, yeah, I wrote, it's no longer acceptable, it hasn't been acceptable for many decades in Western societies to express certain views on the topics in green because of the historical reason that I mentioned earlier, the trauma of the 20th century. Whereas in these fields, in red, a lot of ideologies or views or opinions are morally or politically allowed to express themselves. You have the moral right and the political rights in most Western society to express all sorts of views in economics, finance, law and order, morality, politics, geopolitics, from left to right, as long as you do not express controversial topics, which are considered controversial, on these topics. This is the intellectual frame within which the debate occurs in modern Western society. And here there are very relevant remarks by Monsieur Philippe Nemo, a French libertarian intellectual, who notices, rightly and in a relevant and intelligent way, that in a country like France, there are not only taboo opinions, but there are also taboo topics. So not only, here it's probably specifically valid for France, but actually it applies for a lot of Western countries as well. There are not only views on certain topics which are not considered acceptable, but even just mentioning certain topics without mentioning any opinion, but just talking about certain topics is considered not acceptable. So for instance, talking about demographics or sociobiology or intelligence, whatever the view, it's not considered acceptable. So yeah, just evoking or mentioning these topics has been, and sometimes still is, kind of considered to be a taboo subject. So these are not the opinions which are morally rejected, but the very topics which, however, could constitute a very important aspect of society. So I take an example. In France, in modern France, it's not acceptable morally to talk about sociobiology, biological anthropology, demographics, evolutionary psychology, physiognomy, intelligence, and I know it's not acceptable either in respectable or so-called respectable political circles to talk about this in most other Western societies. But here I just take the particular context of France. In France, even talking about family, morality, and culture in a conservative, traditional way is not considered acceptable either. And here the historical reason is because France collaborated with the Germans in the 1940s, and the ideology of the French state under Pétain was, the slogan was work, family, patriotism, if I had to translate this more or less accurately. So family values and the will to re-establish a moral order. So family values, morality, and religion, here it's specific to France, but they are considered to be taboo topics as well, which is not the case in the US, for instance. And here, precisely, I wrote, in the US, it's not acceptable either, most of the time in respectable society, as they call it, to talk about these topics or to say things which are scientifically true or empirically true about these topics. It's not considered acceptable, but in the US, to talk about culture, family, morality, and religion is considered acceptable. That's why, here I give the perspective of France. The conservatives in America, they are much more right-wing than most people in France, but in Western Europe at large, because precisely they are allowed morally to talk about religion, morality, family values, and the customs, etc., etc. Yeah. And precisely, what I'm talking about is what I call what happens in modernity. The right wing in the Western world over the past many decades, up until the arrival of Trump, one might say, symbolically, limited itself, and still does, in a way, limits itself to these topics. That's the line that the conservatives, or actually any kind of right-wing political parties, are not allowed to cross. Meaning they can express all sorts of views on religion, economics, law and order, sociology, culture, family life, morality, budget, etc. They can express all sorts of views, but they are not morally allowed to talk about these topics in a serious way, when I say. That's how that's the utility of this document, to enable to understand. That's how I interpret this at least. So I wrote, what I just said means that a lot of Western societies, if not all of them, willingly blind themselves by refusing to even discuss certain topics which have become taboo. So Western societies prevent themselves from finding solutions and solving problems because they refuse collectively to mention some topics. And what happens precisely with the advent of the internet and the modern means of communication is that scientific knowledge, which had been censored for decades due to moral for moral reasons, this knowledge is made widely available for those who are interested. It's difficult to find because it's in academic literature, small editors, etc., but it exists in academia and predominantly in the Anglo-Saxon world. So this formerly censored, morally censored knowledge is made available for those who are interested. So I wrote in the nature versus nurture debate. That's in the field of sociology, the social sciences. Nature are those who believe that behavior is determined partly or strongly by heredity, namely by genes, by the natural, anthropological, biological determinations of humans, and the nurture are those who believe that behavior is determined partly or overwhelmingly by culture and morality and law, basically. So usually leftists, they are on the side of nurture, either because they are good intentioned and they genuinely want to improve humans, they genuinely believe in human progress through better organization of social policies. That's the classical liberal ideal, and historically the liberals have been on the left, but they are switching on the right, those who remain true to the creed, progress, science, individualism, limited government, private property, etc. They switch more and more on the right because the historical process tends to go on the left. So the liberals in the noble sense are those who believe, since these are the Enlightenment ideals that Mr. Steven Pinker talks about in a book, Enlightenment Now, for instance, the classical liberals, which in this day and age would be on the right, sometimes still on the left, but also on the right, or sometimes even categorized on the far right, because they believe in the classical ideal of the Enlightenment, progress through reason, individualism, science, investigation, limited government, freedom of expression, debate, etc., etc. So they have, in a way, a very optimistic view of humans because they believe that through better laws, better rights, better policies, better economic conditions, better moral values, they can improve society and the individuals which comprise society. In the sense, the liberals, the classical liberalism is optimistic, not necessarily anthropologically. They can have a pessimistic view of humans and human nature, but they are optimists. They might be pessimistic anthropologically, like some Protestants, the idea of original sin, etc. They can have a pessimistic view of human nature while being very optimistic through action. That will be pessimism of the intelligence and optimism of the will. I think that's from Gramsci, but someone like Rousseau, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who was not strictly speaking a liberal, although he has been a strong inspiration for a lot of leftist and sometimes even right-wing movements. He was Calvinist and pessimistic in a way, but also very optimistic about human nature because he emphasized the notion of progress, Kant as well, so that's a lot of French intellectuals of the 18th century and Anglo-Saxon intellectuals. If the progress was not to be moral or religious, at least a lot of liberals of the 18th century believed that it could be economic and that economic progress would lead to moral improvement. That's the view of, I simplify, the free market advocates, in a way, that better economic conditions would lead to a moral improvement because humans would leave a state of poverty, and it would encourage them to be, it would grant them the opportunity to be more social, in a more moral. That's a very optimistic view, which in a way has partly functioned. That's the view that Mr. Steven Pinker talks about in his book about the Enlightenment, precisely. So, in this nature versus nurture debate, namely, so the leftists, they tend overwhelmingly to believe in the the good intention leftists, this is what I've just talked about, but those who are a little bit more manipulative, usually they just want to use the malleability, the supposed malleability of humans to shape them through political interventionism. Yeah, that's the more manipulative aspect. They want to use the coercive power of the state to shape the new man, communist, socialist, transgender, post-racist, whatever, ecological maybe. So that's one of the problems with the left, yeah. And the right, on the other hand, those who are on the side of nature, in the nature versus nurture debate, they believe in heredity, the predominance of heredity, namely that behaviors are inherited sociobiologically, either collectively, that would be racism in a way, or individually, it can be the differences in IQ. And these people are kind of pessimistic about the ability of public policies to significantly improve human nature. And if they are optimistic, that would be statist eugenics in a way. And that's why they are in favor of a very limited form of government, which grants to diverse individuals and groups to express themselves to the greatest extent of their possibilities, to thrive on an individual level based on their individual merit, one might say, but precisely that's one of the contradictions of the free market view of those who are on the right of right-wing libertarians, someone like Charles Murray. In a way, I mean, it's not necessarily a contradiction because he's aware of this and he's honest. He says that socio-economic status is significantly determined by intelligence, and intelligence is partly or significantly determined by heredity. That's what the agreement, the scientific agreement that Charles Murray comes to in the book The Bell Curve with Richard Einstein. That's why here he says this in the bell curve, and he's very intelligent and honest. He says that the bell curve was in a way thought of as being not I wouldn't say a leftist book. That's not what he said, but a liberal in the sense that he wanted to demonstrate and to prove scientifically that people who are in a difficult economic and social situation, it's not their own fault completely, precisely because they are determined by their, often in this case, limited cognitive capabilities, because it's distributed in a bell-shaped curve. And that's why the message of the bell curve, the political message, is that society should be structured in such a way that it encourages the inclusion of people. And here inclusion, it's in a way a libertarian view of inclusion, not a leftist view. It doesn't mean forceful, coerced, imposed enhancement through diversity or immigration. It means a society where most, if not all, people would find a place. But it's not egalitarian inclusion, it's libertarian inclusion. That's the view of Charles Murray. The political views that he expressed at the end of the bell curve, that a good society is a society where most, if not all, people would fit in, but not based on egalitarian goals or ideals. So a society where people would interact while being conscious of the inner inherent diversity within human groups and among human groups, and where in a way people would be aware that there are people who are more intelligent, and therefore in a free society, a meritocratic society, they tend to be overwhelmingly more successful. So therefore a society where the less well endowed in terms of heredity, which would not be their fault, so that would remove the sense of feeling responsible for what can be considered as failures to compete in the social game, they would be relieved of the burden of responsibility for lower attainments socio-economically, but the counterpart would be to accept that those who succeed in a free society, most of the time, overwhelmingly, they do so because they are more intelligent, but in a way, it's not completely their own merit. So the view of Charles Murray is very subtle. It's partly very American in the most noble sense. That's really an exceptional American thinker, but also it's in a way, it contradicts. That's what he says. I reformulate basically that the left liberal view that he develops is that in a way the bell curve, the book by Charles Murray and Richard Einstein, is a criticism of the self-made man ideology which can be found on the right-wing free markets. Namely, precisely that's what Charles Murray tried to do, to prove that successful individuals, they do not owe all their success just to themselves as individuals, precisely because in modern society the successful tend to be overwhelmingly the most intelligent, and it's significantly determined by heredity and or by the environment, but precisely the environment, here it means the socio-economic environment. The individuals, by the time that their IQ, which is a strong predictor of economic achievements, has settled and stabilized, they haven't had opportunity to shape their own IQ. So that's the leftist view of Charles Murray. So basically to remove the burden of responsibility for what can be considered as socio-economic failure, but also to alleviate the resentment of the less successful by explaining that actually that's kind of true. People who are successful overwhelmingly in modern meritocratic society, they tend to be more intelligent, but precisely it's partly due to their own effort and morality, in the sense of actions and will and discipline and individual willingness, but it's also partly due to their intelligence. So someone who is born and has grown up in an environment which has made it so that he has an IQ of 120, he will be much more likely to succeed socio-economically. So that's the message of the bell curve. It's a profoundly liberal American view in the most noble sense, in the best sense. That's American excellence. That's the view of the bell curve. So, I wrote about Western societies willingly blinding themselves for moral reason. A very simple example, now it should be clear, but the economy is completely unintelligible without reference to intelligence and IQ. It's not sufficient, but without mentioning the differences in intelligence between individuals and between different groups of individuals, there are both aspects. The economy is completely unintelligible. To say that in order to become a successful lawyer, a successful engineer, a successful physician, successful architect, etc., you have to have a very high level of intelligence compared to the means, one might say, and that people with lower level of intelligence in terms of IQ, they struggle to compete in a more and more demanding economy because of the improvement of technology, etc. That's in a way the leftist message of Charles Murray in the bell curve. He says precisely that life is becoming increasingly difficult in modern society for people with a lower level of intelligence, because society is being more and more complexified by the development of technology and the means of communication and the requirements of a complex society. So in a way that's a humanist message. Also, another example, politics in the broadest sense. Here it includes all these aspects. Politics in the broadest sense is completely unintelligible if there are no references to sociobiology in the broadest sense. Here sociobiology would mean all or most of the categories in green. So basically formulated differently, the categories in red are unintelligible without references, knowledge, understanding of the categories in green. Yeah. So I wrote, the problem is formulated differently. If the bad guys were correct partly, whoever the bad guys may be, in a less controversial topic than just sociobiology, if we discuss economics, the bad guys in economics, these are the libertarians, Hayek, Milton Friedman, Mises, etc., the free market economists. What if the bad guys were proven to be epistemologically correct? Which, here I express an opinion, but actually it's backed up by reason and empiricism a lot of time. A lot of time the people who are considered to be bad guys, not always, but they are correct on a lot of their views epistemologically, not necessarily politically, but epistemologically. A lot of views about science, actually, how should I explain it? The people who are considered to be the bad guys in the modern West, either in economics or sociology, people who are controversial, etc., they happen to be epistemologically correct a lot of times, and it's not because they are bad guys that they are correct, but it's because they are correct that they are considered to be bad guys. It's also reciprocal determination, but basically the modern West, actually it's not new because it was already the case with Galileo in a different setting, but people who just express scientifically correct or accurate views, a lot of time they are considered to be disruptive for the balance of society, and their ideas are rejected. Yeah. So the question is, if it's not necessarily always the case, but if the bad guys were or are correct, at least on some topics epistemologically, what should be done? What to do? What if it was so that the people who are considered to be evil or bad, what if they spoke important truths which enable society to understand itself, and therefore that would be the condition to avoid regression, decline, decadence, and also to enable progress? What to do then? It's a very serious question. And I wrote, the leftist view of what is good, the good would be morality, or even religion, even if it's an atheist religion, the views on of the left are often fervently religious, unconsciously, when I say. What if, actually no, it's not what if, it's not a what if, but the leftist view of the good very often, not always, but very often, is founded upon delusions, deceptions, and or lies. So the question that I wrote is, why does the left has so often the moral high ground if leftists, consciously or unconsciously, delude themselves, deceive others, and or sometimes, often, depending on the context, lie? So why, the question, reformulated, why are leftists, why are they so often the good guys if, in spite of, or because of maybe, they lie or deceive or delude themselves and others so often? That's a very serious philosophical question. And here I will try to briefly answer this question as I understand this. So that's the category modern Western politics. I wrote the right wing, the right wingers of the establishment right, or the establishment right wingers, never mention sociobiology. This is precisely what defines them as politically correct, I might say. More authentic right-wingers, in a way, they try to be as right-wing as possible because they are right-wingers, but also because they try to bring balance to the excesses of the left. So some right-wingers, they try to be as right-wing as possible without ever mentioning controversial topics. And here, the example, I do not even try to fool others and nor to fool myself on it, because I've already said this and I will continue to do so. The libertarians, especially the right-wing libertarians, it's a means for predominantly white people, not only, but predominantly, it can be empirically verified, to assert themselves in a politically acceptable way, a politically respectable way, to advocate right-wing ideas without mentioning really controversial topics. So libertarianism is, in the modern world, in the modern Western world, the only, or at least the most respectable way for white people to be right-wingers. But it can be thought of that some libertarians, they are just crypto-fascist. That's the accusation from the left. But actually, there are, here I know from experience, a significant proportion of them, they genuinely believe in what they preach. Namely, it's not, some of them, maybe they do, some try to use libertarianism to advance in a deceptive way, really fascist, here it's in the negative sense, fascist ethno-nationalist views. But there are also, among libertarians, a significant proportion of really right-wing white people, or non-white, but right-wing people who are genuine libertarians. They genuinely reject collectivism, authoritarianism, collectivist authoritarianism, because they don't believe in this. And here I take an example. Someone like Hans Hermann Hoppe is not considered acceptable among all libertarian circles, precisely because he talks openly about intelligence and anthropology in his writings, IQ and race in a way, which is sufficient to make him controversial, even among some right-wing libertarians, precisely because that's the symbolic threshold which is not supposed to be crossed. So I wrote about the United States of America as a meritocratic society. The rules of the game, the rules of the social game in the US, they are the same for all in a way, but here precisely, that's connected with the authentic libertarians, if they are white. Here I will talk about authentic white libertarians. A truly libertarian society would be in a way a meritocratic society, at least formally. Then, of course, the question of merit, when you study science, precisely that's what I said earlier, individual merit, when you inherit your genes, you are born in a society that you have not chosen, you are determined by the language, the culture, the upbringing, etc. You are the laws. You are not a blank slate when you are born as an empirical individual. So but authentic, genuine libertarians, they accept the rules of the game, namely that society is supposed to be to encourage competition and to award and to reward the most successful if they have not cheated, to reward them with better wages, better lifestyle, better prospect if they play fair. And precisely because the libertarians, here it means free market economists, understand that it's the best way to satisfy the greatest number of people, precisely because the rich, that's the old view of Adam Smith, not the rich, but the ambitious, by pursuing their own personal interests, they want to succeed either because they are interested in money or because they want to achieve status or they want to improve their well-being, whatever the psychological motives of action. They desire recognition, to be conscious. They seek recognition, status, dominance, prosperity, wealth, or achievement, or whatever the psychological motive. Classical, liberal, free market society, one might say. Liberal here, because the free market is not enough, but liberal in a sense of societies built around the idea of liberty, individual liberty. They understand that by allowing the most ambitious, the most talented to prosper, and by limiting the hindrances, the regulations put on talented individuals, these individuals will produce, not because they are altruistic necessarily, but by pursuing their own selfish ends, by being motivated by status, prestige, wealth, whatever, achievement, they will bring about, most of the time, benefits for the whole of society. It was already the case in pre-modern aristocratic societies, namely the nobility was motivated by a search for honor, prestige, and nobility, and it was a means for the kings to manipulate the aristocracy by encouraging their search for status and prestige to encourage the benefit of society. But precisely there came a moment in modernity where it was considered, because of the moral and economic conditions, that the bourgeois, that's partly a Marxist analysis, but also partly a liberal analysis, that the bourgeois, the entrepreneur, replaced the aristocrat as an ideal, because that's the view of the early economists in the 17th, 18th, and still 19th century, that the entrepreneur, he fulfills his will to power by pleasing indirectly or directly his fellow men, whereas the aristocrat, his search for status, achievement, it could be achieved only through battles and wars, and war had become very costly, not only financially but in terms of men and of social well-being, since the advent of the modern weapons, especially the Napoleonic War, and then the Secession War, and even more the First World War, wars have become more and more costly for society, and it is no longer an acceptable means for men to assert their search for dominance and status, because the damages that can be inflicted onto societies and onto other men have become, in a way, too massive. So here, that's Nietzsche was already aware of this, that the economy and industry is a means for humans, for men especially, to channel their will to power. And what the aristocrats of old did on the battlefield, the modern aristocrats, these are the entrepreneurs, and they do this through innovation. So that's a way of channeling, in a way, an impulse for dominance and assertion within all humans, to channel this, instead of on the battlefield, to direct this in productive endeavors. And what the ecological criticism is that even when men stop fighting on the battlefield and they invest their energy in the economy, it brings about bad consequences for the planet and for the long-term welfare of the species. So that's the leftist ecological criticism of capitalism. But fighting, one might say, symbolically or metaphorically, in the economic competition is a means to avoid fighting on the battlefield, and to use energy and a search for assertion for productive purposes. Formulated differently, the human will to power, and especially masculine will to power, it's much more productive if it is invested in economic productivity and innovation than if it is invested in warfare and struggle. But of course, the two are partly connected. But yeah. So, yeah, about the rules of the meritocratic competitive game in liberal society, empirically, in the United States of America, which is the most capitalist society, in the noble sense here, capitalist means the ideology, namely the idea that you have to compete with others, and those who succeed more deserve to be more rewarded, and those who are less successful, they have to be helped to the greatest extent possible without restricting too much the freedom of others and without being a hindrance on society. But the less successful have to be helped through charity, predominantly. That's the classical American view. But they have to accept that they are less successful, and the most successful society has to accept that they are most successful because they are more talented or more productive or more ambitious. That's what I call the capitalist mindset in this perspective, namely to try to reduce resentment because inequalities are acknowledged as being inevitable in a free society. And yeah. So in a sense, it's a praise in this. When I say here capitalist ideology, here it's in a praiseworthy way, namely the ideal of competition, and that there are inequalities within society, and that resentment has to be overcome to the greatest extent possible by acknowledging the greatness of those who achieve. Yeah. Of course, there is crony capitalism. There are those who are privileged because they have inherited wealth, etc. But those who succeed in a meritocratic society, they are supposed to be acknowledged, not necessarily acknowledged, but at least not to be envied too much by others, because it is supposed to be publicly acknowledged that they have been successful because they have provided goods and services that their other fellow men have accepted to buy on their own free will. That's why artists, entertainers, show businessmen, showmen, sportsmen, innovators, entrepreneurs, businessmen, etc. are still more praised and admired in the US than in more collectivist society, because the people, they have the consciousness that these people a lot of time bring value to society, and if you do not like the product that they offer, if the society is free, you are not forced to consume or to buy their products. If you don't like ball games, if you don't like a certain musical artist, if you don't like the products of a certain company, you do not have the legal obligation to buy what they produce. But a lot of time you are kind of socially constrained to adapt. You are in a way, you are not legally forced to have smartphone, but you are socially constrained. Yeah, that's the criticism of the left. But to have a moral and social to have a social obligation to remain competitive economically or to remain trendy socially, etc. To have a social obligation is not as coercive as having a legal obligation. Yeah, when the state imposes a policy, it is forcefully imposed on everyone. It's coercive. It's much more coercive than the moral peer pressure, when I say. Yeah. That's why formal freedom is better than no freedom at all. And a lot of time, historically, socialists or communists, they have denounced the lack of real freedom by emphasizing the formal aspect of the freedom of free societies, but historically, communist societies have not even granted formal freedoms to their citizens. There was no real freedom economically in terms of opportunity, etc. And there was no formal freedom either. In free societies, often there is not real freedom for a lot of people, because precisely if you are born underprivileged in terms of intelligence, skills, beauty, or if you are discriminated because of your race or your ethnicity or your gender, etc., it is true that you are less likely to succeed than if you belong to a favored group, but you still have the formal freedom in a free society. In a lot of non-free society, even the formal freedom does not exist. Yeah. So yeah, in the socio-economic game in a society like the US, the authentic libertarians, they accept this because for them it's not a psychological or moral problem that, for instance, in the US, Northeast Asians, Jews, sometimes Indians of India, do better than whites, and black and or Hispanics do as well often as whites if they are checked for IQ. This is what the bell curve teaches, namely that in the United States of America in the 1980s, early 1990s, if the various ethnic groups were checked for IQ, with a same IQ, whites, blacks, and Hispanics, they earned broadly the same income. So it was meritocratic in this sense. And a lot of authentic libertarians, they accept the fact that because on average Northeast Asians and Jews have a higher IQ than whites, and Indians of India, if they are top immigrants, engineers, really highly educated people, it means that they have overwhelmingly a higher IQ. So they accept that these people do better, which is empirically true in terms of income and achievements, etc. They accept this because it's part of what a meritocratic society is. So they have less resentment, and among authentic libertarians, very few people complain that on average Northeast Asians do better, Jews do better than whites on average, because they have on average higher IQs. Yeah. Yeah. So the progression of this document, it's in a way a logical progression from lower to higher, and founding politics on sociobiology, making biology the end and the center of politics, is considered to be kind of regressive. I explain, I mean, a lot of people in the modern West agree with this, precisely that's why the ideologies which founded their policies on biology are morally rejected overwhelmingly. And historically, very few, if not no European society, here European means populated by white people, did this, except Sparta in ancient Greece and National Socialist Germany, and to a certain extent the supremacist colonies in a way in the 18th, 19th century. But very few European societies historically have been consciously founded upon biology, and in the great eras of European history and in the great European societies, the various countries, kingdoms, republics, etc., and the great individual Europeans over the past 2,500 years were very rarely consciously white. And here I explain, it means that race consciousness, of course, it existed and it has been intensified in a way by encounter with non-whites, with the discovery of the Americas, and then the colonization of Africa, Australia, etc. But what could be called race consciousness, it existed among Europeans. In a way, it has always existed, but it was limited historically within the bloodline, the caste or the tribe. Namely, the aristocrats throughout the history of Europe had a very high sense of their biological belongings, but they thought in terms of bloodline and in terms of aristocratic blood. Namely, it was a limited group within a racially homogeneous society. So nationalism is a modern, in a way democratic, in a way collectivist ideology. The Aryan elites, the European elites, have historically almost always been aristocratic and individualistic. That I explain here why collectivist nationalism is rejected by right-wing whites. Not all of them, but those who do. They do so in the name of an opposition against collectivism. Here, really, the most noble, either in blood or in prestige, European elites, they have very often, if not always, been aristocratic and individualistic. That's why they have opposed collectivism in all its forms, whether it's economic collectivism, any communism, socialism, or statism, but also nationalism, in a way. Yeah. And here, spirit, in a way, is that which is distinct or detached from nature. And nature means the biological, here in the case of human, the biological determination. So spirit is that which elevates itself above nature, beyond nature, in a way. That's why the left has so often the moral high ground, because, in a way, they are more spiritual, at least, I wrote at least in their speech, in what they say. They are more spiritual, their slogans, their values are more appealing, precisely because they are more elevated spiritually, at least in the preaching, precisely. But the leftists, so the left, that's the reason why it has the moral high ground, but they are, in a way, they are regressive because they reject science, which is a form of spirituality in a broader sense. So a lot of leftists, in a way, they are morally superior because they preach more universal, more spiritual, more noble ideals, values. They found their political views on values and not on natural biological determination. That's why they are so appealing to a lot of people. But in a way, so that's their progressive aspect. But in a way, they are regressive sometimes because precisely they reject rationality and science in the name of irrational belief, collectivist belief. And their tolerance is a noble, I will explain why, it's a noble virtue in a way. That's why it's so appealing, those who present themselves as being tolerant. That's why they have the moral high ground very often. But actually, the tolerance of the left very often leads, when it's excessive, to tolerating degenerate or unacceptable behavior. So that's the limits, the virtues and the limits of the left, is that their tolerance enables them to gain the moral high ground, but if it's not checked, it leads very often to unacceptable, intolerable behaviors, precisely. And the right is often immoral in the sense, I explain, in the sense that if they speak about natural determination, not all right-wingers do, but those who do, in a way, they are immoral in the sense that nature here it means biology in the case of human, is that which has no morality, precisely because, not because it's immoral, but because it's amoral. It means it's not immoral or moral in a sense of value judgment, it's indifferent in a way. And here morality means, it's another word for the will, and precisely nature has no will of its own, no conscious will of its own, because it unconsciously obeys laws. Nature does not purposefully act, only humans do, because they attach meaning and intention and goals to their actions. That's the view of praxeology. So in this sense, will or morality in this sense is that which is opposed to nature. That's why the moral sciences historically have been politics, economics, finance, law, morality, etc. And the natural sciences have been physics, chemistry, biology. Yeah. So will in a way, which here is another word for morality, is that which extracts itself out of nature by setting itself goals, purposes, by consciously acting, whereas nature unconsciously acts. The planets and the animals are not aware of the laws that they obey, whereas humans, when they give themselves conscious laws, they become conscious of their own laws that they give to themselves, in a way. Animals, other than human animals, cannot do this. Neither can planets. But humans, precisely, they can consciously give themselves laws and be conscious and be aware of the rules which regulate their behavior. Whereas the animals, the stones, the trees, the planets, the stars are not aware of this as such. So, to be moral, precisely, here it means to exercise the will, it means to exist, to act in opposition to nature. Here precisely, it doesn't mean good or bad, here it means to be moral, if it is defined as the will, it means to exert itself against nature, against the given natural instinctive determinations. And here it explains why Nietzsche, who was in a way in favor of the vital instincts, considered that Christian morality is hostile to life, precisely because Christian morality, which in a way is the most elevated form of morality, in a sense, because it's very hostile to a lot of natural inclinations, because Christian morality is opposed to sexual promiscuity, it's opposed to selfishness, it's opposed to racism, it is opposed to a lot of natural instinctive tendencies, and therefore it's the most demanding because it requires the greatest amount of will, because precisely, naturally, instinctively, humans are interested in sex and aggression against other groups and sometimes aggressive behavior against other individuals. Naturally, people are selfish, they are attracted by greed, lust, gluttony, laziness, etc. The classical sin. This is, in a way, natural in a sense that animals no, precisely, here that's a little bit more subtle, precisely, animals, they are not greedy or lustful, etc. But so here, no, that would be the list of the sins, it's more complex, but basically to have sexual interest, to be interested in food, drink, sex, and to have in-group, out-group biases, to be prejudiced, to have lower tendencies as opposed to the higher ideal, precisely, to obey instinctive tendencies, it is considered in most religions, but especially in Christianity, to be bad as opposed to the good, which is presented as the goal which must be achieved, the moral good. Precisely, it's a struggle against the natural instinctive tendency, and in this sense, this is why Christian morality, in the view of Nietzsche, someone like Nietzsche, is hostile to life, because it preaches moral instincts which precisely are opposed to most of the instincts which have enabled the evolution and the perpetuation of life. Namely, because altruism, it's a moral virtue from a Christian standpoint, but in the natural world, there exist forms of altruism amongst animals, and it's wired into the human brain. Altruistic behavior are wired into evolutionary psychology of a lot of high organisms, including humans precisely, but instinctively individuals tend to be selfish. So precisely, morality in a broader sense means here Christian or non-Christian, but it means to take the other into account. And the further away this other is, the more moral you are, because the more demanding it is. Namely, spontaneously humans are wired to care for themselves as individuals, to propagate their genes, to survive and propagate their genes, but they are also programmed to care about their family, their offsprings, their siblings, their tribe, their genetic kin. That's biologically wired. This is what evolutionary psychology teaches us, to defend the interests directly or indirectly of people who are like them, because it's in the individual's interest to a certain extent to live in a cooperative social setting, evolutionarily and socially. And that's why to act and to be moral towards the out group is the most demanding form, because it's the most counterintuitive evolutionarily, namely biologically, namely to help the foreigners, the strangers, the opponents, etc. That's completely counter instinctive from a biological standpoint, and that's why it is so appealing morally, because it's a goal, it's difficult to reach, it's demanding, and that's why it is moral in the sense of being a will which opposes nature. I explain. So in this sense, the left is moral and the right is immoral, in this sense, namely whether you are in favor or against the natural inclinations. And because the left they advocate so many views, moral views, legislative and political views, which are opposed to the natural inclinations of man. I mean, communism is forcefully imposed altruism in a way, and multiculturalism is forcefully imposed anti-racism in a way. So it's just the leftist ideology. They are a struggle against the natural inclinations of man. This is why they fail most of the time when it's excessive, and it's also why they are nonetheless so appealing, precisely because they offer a transcendence in a way. They transcend the lower instincts, but here from the perspective of the left. That's why the left is so appealing, because it offers a perspective of transcendence, not religious but moral transcendence. That's why the left, they are so appealing, especially to young people or to the deprived also, because they offer a noble ideal of a moral man, an altruistic man, a color-blind man, a post-gender man, a post-racial man, a post-class society, etc. It's a goal, namely it evokes desires for that's a utopian view in a way, whereas the right is much more realistic and therefore much less appealing in terms of imagination and appeal, one might say, but it's much more realistic, precisely. And the struggle against the natural impulses inherited by nature. Again, so the struggle against the natural impulses and instincts is precisely what morality is. Here I do not talk about any specific moral requirements, but simply morality being defined as an act of the will which opposes the tendencies of nature. This is precisely what morality is, the will which opposes nature. So here examples: restraint, self-mastery, self-control, renunciation, patience, tolerance, color blindness, altruism. These are forms of morality because it requires to work on oneself, to restrain oneself, to discipline oneself, to grow, to be patient, to accept others with which one disagrees or which one does not spontaneously like, to transcend race, to transcend selfishness, etc. These are moral ideals which are often preached by the left, but precisely no, because restraint, self-control, renunciation, and patience, these are more right-wing values. Tolerance as well, in a way. The right-wingers, they tend to be a lot more tolerant than the left. So, to judge individuals on the content of their character and not on the color of their skin, that's the ideal of Martin Luther King, is good. Precisely here, good means an act of the will. It's a manifestation of will and morality, precisely because it demands an effort. It requires a struggle in a way. There are people who are determined to be more or less spontaneously good in this sense that I've just mentioned. But precisely it's good because it's kind of difficult, it requires an effort, and the character of people, it depends on them, whereas the color of their skin doesn't. But actually, what science teaches precisely is that there is a connection between genes and behavior, so the character of individuals does not solely depend on them, it's partly sociobiologically, socially, culturally determined, etc., etc. But an individual, in a way, at least most of the time, humans have the illusion that, and the belief that individuals can exert a greater will on their individual character than on their biological determinations. In a way, that's why you can expect most of the time any individual to improve, or at least most individuals to improve in terms of character, whatever their other determinations are, but the biological determination, being born male, female, black, white, Asian, tall, short, intelligent, dull, ugly, beautiful, average, etc., you cannot change this, or it's very difficult, even with the progress of medicine, etc. So I wrote, that's why the left wins so often, because they use nice sounding moralistic universalist slogans, and of course, as I have defined morality, namely an act of the will against the tendencies, the spontaneous, instinctive, primitive, one might say, tendency. If what is moral is good because it requires an act of the will, then anti-racism, of course, is good. Solidarity, and especially altruism, solidarity it's reciprocal, self-interested interest, precisely, but altruism and tolerance are good precisely because they are not easy. It requires an effort to judge people on the content of their character more than on the color of their skin or their gender or their physiognomic determination, precisely because to consider the character of a person, it requires more efforts, more time, more dedication, a higher sense of judgment than simply to classify, to say, he's a black person, therefore, or it works in the other way. To say, oh, it's a white person, therefore he is whatever, negative determination which are associated with whatever, or that's a woman, therefore, or that's a man, therefore, or this person is not good looking, therefore, or this person is good looking, therefore, etc. It's easier to judge on the outer aspect and more difficult to grasp the inner because precisely it's more subtle and it requires more effort, more time, etc. But precisely here, studying sciences teaches us that making quick judgments, biases, to be prejudiced, of course it's morally wrong by our standards, but in a lot of situations it proves to be evolutionarily useful when you have to make quick decisions to judge an individual, to categorize him on his group belonging, whether it's gender, race, or culture, language, economic status. It's a lot easier. That's why it's difficult in a way to be moral, precisely. So, but the problem, so the ideals of the left, overwhelmingly, they sound good and they are good as ideals, but the problem is that a lot of leftists are hypocrites in the sense that there are a lot of hypocritical, if not downright degenerate behaviors which are found on the left, on the right as well, but the leftists, in a way, they are more prone to claiming virtue. They are not necessarily worse morally than the right-wingers, but the right-wingers, usually they are less they proclaim less their virtue. Honest right-wingers, they do not say, oh, we are better. Sometimes they do, but they simply say, humans are the way they are. Often they are selfish, they are self-interested. There are differences in intelligence, differences in talent and ability, etc., etc., and we have to accept this. And that's the kind of the cynical, realistic view of right-wing conservatives, classical conservatives. Yeah, so they are less utopian in a way, but which makes them to be more authentic in a sense that they do not claim to be necessarily morally better. That's why they are much. There are less hypocrites on the right than on the left. Not because the right-wingers are better, but because the leftists, they proclaim their virtues much more, much more extensively than right-wingers. Yeah. Because the right-wingers, they offer less expectations in terms of ideals, so they disappoint much less often, much less frequently, because their ideals are much less ambitious than those of the left. And the left, they claim utopian ideals. We will abolish, they want to abolish class distinctions, race distinction, gender distinction, but the ideal, in a way, that's the problem of the left. It's very appealing because it promises to solve a lot of problems, but it's so difficult to reach that it fails overwhelmingly and brings about all sorts of problems individually, collectively, etc. Yeah. And I wrote also the people who are genuinely racist, one might say, or those who are cognitivist in the sense of they are obsessed with IQ and intelligence. Here I will not pretend to be good on this perspective, because I can be obsessed sometimes from a scientific standpoint with both IQ or sociobiological determination, because it enables to understand. So I might have sometimes a tendency to be to put a lot of emphasis and focus on these topics, yeah, and that's why they are considered to be regressive. And here another example from the bell curve is that there's a quote of a scholar who said, to believe that IQ is sufficient to judge an individual, and that by making a test and having the quantitative determination of intelligence of a person in 50 minutes basically, or 15 minutes maybe, but basically if to judge a person based on his IQ, it's considered to be morally wrong, and it's considered to be regressive, precisely because humans have many more characteristics than just quantitative intelligence, and it's not a guarantee of morality, precisely because people with lower intelligence in terms of IQ, they can be more emotionally intelligent, they can be more dedicated as husbands, mothers, friends, participants in civic associations, etc. And that's the reason precisely why ideas like racism or IQ are rejected by the mainstream society, when I say even though or although they sometimes or often might be partly correct scientifically, because it's reductive to judge an individual on one characteristic only. That's why what can be scientifically true is often, in the realm of social sciences, considered to be morally reprehensible. But the problem, so here I explain why leftist views tend to dominate, but the problem is that here, in the case of IQ, cognitive blindness, namely to act socially and institutionally as if all humans had the same level of intelligence, and as if IQ was not a significant determinant of social outcome, to act as if, which is what Western societies have been doing for decades, it brings about a whole lot of problems, because to implement policies which are based on faulty assumption of equality, it leads to a lot of economic and social problems. Hiring people based on IQ tests, it is considered to be discriminatory and morally wrong, but not doing so, it leads to an enormous amount of waste and inefficiencies in economics, which lead to social problems. And the same goes with sociobiology, either in ethnicity or gender. To refuse to acknowledge for moral reason the differences among individuals based on gender, and groups based on ethnic determination, to not to take this into account and to falsely assume that everyone is equal, it leads, when policies are built on this false assumption, it leads to problems on a collective scales. So good intentions, they bring about collective disasters sometimes. So the left, they have the moral high ground, and the right-wingers on this topic here, let us talk about IQ, they appear as being the bad guys, but the consequences of the noble ideals promoted by the left, very often, they lead to social and economic problems, whereas the right-wingers, they are less appealing, but they are more efficient. So, also I wrote racism. Here, if it means to discriminate or to hate or to oppress, here these are different terms, because to discriminate, a country which has borders distinguishes between its own citizens and foreigners, and if borders and having a citizenry is discriminatory, then the overwhelming majority of countries on this planet, actually most of them except Western, predominantly white countries, are discriminatory, if we define this in the case of borders, or to have a preference for the native populations in terms of civic rights. Most countries on this planet are discriminatory. Yeah. So, precisely, I wrote the problem with racism is that it's very difficult to define. I mean, it's not difficult to define, but people use the word with an ill-defined, indeterminate meaning, with a shifting meaning. But if racism means to hate someone or to oppress someone because of his collective belonging, it's morally wrong, and it's not very smart. It's kind of stupid to wish to hurt someone or to reject someone on an individual level based on racist prejudices. It works for misogyny as well, etc. But I wrote, according to the very ill-defined definition of racism as understood in the modern, or precisely as misunderstood in the modern West, the overwhelming majority of countries on this planet are racist if being racist means not wishing for your people, or the people that you identify as your own ethnically or culturally or historically, not wishing your people to be demographically replaced in their own historical homeland. This is the implicit definition of racism. If this is the definition, then the overwhelming majority of countries on this planet could be considered racist, because very few countries, except modern Western countries, willingly promote conditions, political conditions, which lead in the long term to the erasure, the demographic erasure of their historical native population. So yeah. And I wrote, white leftists, a lot of them, consciously or unconsciously, they have supremacist beliefs, because they have much higher standards of expected behavior for whites than they do for non-whites, which means that there are a lot of behaviors that white leftists tolerate among some non-whites that they would not tolerate for white people. Yeah, and that's true for the right as well, but yeah. White people here, I understand why non-whites might dislike white people on this topic, independently of ideology, leftist, right-wingers, and why some non-whites might think that all whites are whatever, racist or whatever. That it's true that white people, whether they are leftist or right-wingers, a lot of them, they tend to have different set of expectations for whites and non-whites. Namely, here, right-wing whites and leftist whites, they can agree on this, at least. There are really behaviors which are not accepted morally if they are perpetrated by white people, whether you are a left-winger or right-winger. In this sense, the left, they tend to caricature the far right, but actually among the overwhelming majority of right-wing white people, they all agree that there are really behavior, here I talk about acts of violence perpetrated by whites, or acts of misconduct, etc. The overwhelming majority of decent people on the right, and there are a lot of decent people on the right, they condemn genuinely, and they genuinely reject behaviors which are not acceptable among their own ethnic group. And this is simply the reason why the radical right, fails, and has very often failed. Historically, it's not just because of the left or because of the minority groups which are supposed to dominate economy and sometimes do, but it's because there is a strong proportion of the right, and even sometimes the radical right, which is opposed to certain behaviors based on aristocratic ideals. Here, formulated differently, there are a lot of genuinely conservative, not the modern conservative, but genuinely authentic white conservatives, libertarians, even aristocrats, and right-wingers who are very well aware of all the topics which are listed here, and who are really right-wing, sometimes radical right-wing views, who are nonetheless who nonetheless do not tolerate for white people behaviors, certain set of behaviors that the left tolerates among sometimes non-whites. So yeah. So formulated differently, very, very few white people, even among the most radical branches of the right, believe to this day that the slavery or colonialism and the excesses that it brought, or the most excessive form of racism, very few people find this a source of either pride or even, even among, when I say here, that's an aristocratic view, historically, yeah, a little bit of culture, the aspects of the right in European societies in the 19th century were opposed to the excesses of slavery and a lot of authentic right-wing aristocrats. Here it means in terms of ideology. It can also mean in terms of blood, but a lot of right-wingers opposed colonialist and imperialist policies, sometimes, not always, sometimes. And here, I understand why white people are often criticized for various reasons, but by themselves and by others, but there are a lot of very decent people among the so-called right-wingers who, if they had to look at the historical process, very few, if not almost no white people find any sense of pride in some of the excesses of the past. Honest, here, I say intelligently, honest, usually right-wingers with a culture, they acknowledge that, of course, there have been excesses and negative consequences for non-whites of colonialism, obviously, but honest people, they acknowledge that it has brought positive aspects as well in terms of increase in demographics, life expectancy, access to hygiene, health, economic opportunities, etc. But healthy people, they tend to condemn the most excessive aspect of the past. In this sense, the left, they tend to caricature the right, but there are a lot of balanced, healthy people on the right, and precisely this is why a lot of right-wingers, they reject the sometimes extreme fringes of the right, whereas a lot of leftists rarely do or don't do this as consistently with the radical fringes on the left. That's another reason why the left wins so often, is that the right-wingers, they are much less collectivist and they are much more demanding with their own, and they are much less willing to tolerate deviant, non-acceptable behavior among themselves, whereas leftists, they tend to accept behavior which are very dubious on the fringes of their group sometimes. That's why they have more unity in a way, and that's why they win more often. But eventually it's based on a morally wrong views in a way. And here I will conclude with precisely spirit. To found policies solely based on race, it's morally wrong in a way, but not to take this into account at all, like it has been the case for many decades, or even to implement policies which are explicitly or implicitly detrimental to sociobiological, demographic, and anthropological interests, it's wrong as well. But how should I explain this? Race, from a spiritual perspective, is a means. It's a means, and it should not be an end in itself, precisely because the end, the purpose of society ought to be spiritual, and spirit precisely is that which extracts itself out of nature to refine itself, to purify itself in terms of elevation, when I say. That's why the means and the ends do not have to be mistaken. And here I wrote, a lot of white people, in a way, they are forced, and here I identify with them, they are forced to care about race because of the dire circumstances in which modern Western societies find themselves and the prospect in a long-term attack. So in a way they are forced to care about this topic, but actually for authentic right-wingers, putting too much emphasis on race is kind of regressive, precisely because what is really important is spiritual, and even in the most religious traditional views of European, the classical European religion, the body is just a costume. It's a carrier of the soul and of the spirit. The soul, the mind, of the spirit. So the body is important in a way, but it's just a tool, and the spirit is that which is carried by the body, and the purpose, conscious or unconscious, of humans as individuals and as society is to elevate themselves morally in a broader sense, and artistically, religiously, and philosophically, which includes all the previous aspects, morality in the realm of society, politically, one might say, but the purpose is spiritual. Yeah. Well, I will conclude, but the overwhelming majority of mankind's greatest spiritual achievements, empirically, have been the product of Europeans, anthropological Europeans. Not only, of course, there have been great achievements on the part of people of most origins in terms of science, economics, politics, religion, etc., etc. But the overwhelming majority, if we look at this from an objective standpoint, here Charles Murray wrote a book, Human Accomplishment, about this. The overwhelming majority of the greatest achievements in the sciences and the arts have been the product of anthropological Europeans, namely white people. That's what science teaches. It doesn't mean, it doesn't mean, here I state the obvious, but it doesn't mean that all or even most white people are especially gifted. It doesn't mean that non-whites cannot achieve great spiritual achievements. They have and they continue to do so. And a lot of white people who are ordinary, decent people in many regards, they are not especially gifted, they are not superior in any way in terms of creative achievements. Common sense forces us to agree with this, but nonetheless, empirically, the overwhelming majority of the greatest spiritual achievements, here it pervades the totality, one would say, have been and still are to this day the product of white people. So that's an empirical